Although decisions at the UNGA are not legally binding, some believe the vote could be used in an attempt to put pressure on both Russia and China. RT's Anastasia Turkinla followed the latest gathering in New York.
We've been hearing speeches from dozens of countries that started early in the morning, and of course this comes only a week after a double veto from Russia and China blocked an Arab and Western-backed resolution on Syria at the Security Council. So what we saw is an attempt from the Saudi Arabia and Qatar to go to another body of the United Nations in an attempt to find some kind of decision there. And even though the General Assembly does consist of over 190 members, we have to keep in mind that it's not nearly as powerful as the Security Council, because whatever decision comes out of the General Assembly is by no means binding. It's only seen as a recommendation by the rest of the international community. And what's key here is that the text of the supposed resolution that the General Assembly will be voted on has not even been circulated yet. We're hearing that it's going to be pretty much the same document that Russia and China vetoed. And Russia's and China's problem with the text was that it seemed biased to the countries, saying that it only named the Syrian government as the main cause of the conflicts going on the ground in Syria, but not the armed groups. And that's something that continues to be a major sticking point, the recognition of two sides to this conflict by the international community.
The effort to end violence should come with negotiation attempts involving all Syrian forces, including the government and the opposition. In order to start the talks, the countries that have an influence over the opposition groups, who until now have been unwilling to commit, should exert their power.
We've been hearing all of these countries make speeches today saying that the Syrian government is committing atrocities. So really this is another opportunity for those who do support regime change on the ground to send out criticism towards the Syrian government.
Please let us criticize what is going on right now against Syria.
Gestures being attempted at the United Nations does not...
Completely unacceptable.
Any sort of document is not going to...
We need some grassroots protests around the world to protest what the West, especially the United States, is doing against Syria.
At the General Assembly these days, and not just, a lot of words of criticism.
Well, former UN correspondent Ian Williams says if the action on Syria is pushed through the UN General Assembly, it could have unwelcome consequences for some world powers.
Let's hope it doesn't happen.
Arab countries and the Western countries want to show that they're doing something. If they were serious, then they would have pressed for a special General Assembly, an emergency special General Assembly meeting under the Uniting for Peace resolution. And this, you might remember, in a field rich with irony, was the form that the US and Britain used to fight the Korean War in the face of a Soviet veto in the early 50s. Since then, it was resurrected by the Palestinians to bypass the American veto in the Security Council. And that, I presume, is why it is not being invoked now. Because you use the phrase a non-binding resolution. The resolution that established the State of Israel and partitioned it was a General Assembly resolution. So if that was not binding, then where do we go from there? And, what we have is some powers say that resolutions they like are binding and resolutions they don't like are non-binding. The Qatari president of the General Assembly could have followed earlier precedent and said that there was sufficient support for an emergency special session. But he hasn't done so, and I'm sure...
Russia today is doing a great job in covering this stuff, which is just almost ignored in the West, at least this view of what is going on.
And the US vetoes a Palestinian resolution.
Well, alarming reports continue to emanate from the protest hub of Homs as opposition activists suggest the city is suffering its heaviest shelling for days. And with the spiraling violence now being fanned by players such as Al-Qaeda, there are concerns that the crisis could become increasingly sectarian.
Al-Qaeda in Syria. Boy, isn't that just great. The Al-Qaeda, which actually has been and evidently now is an ally of the U.S. in de facto reality. This is the Al-Qaeda representative saying that he has the same goals in a particular situation with Syria as the United States. They are de facto allies.
And they're not focusing on the potential problems that Syria could lead into another Iraq.
On the streets, though, and an increasingly desperate population has called for help in whatever form it comes, as long as it stops the violence. There's little time for them to think about long-term sectarian rifts, whilst many of them are worrying about daily survival.
anyone who protects us, we are ready to hear, to say yes to anyone who protects us from this regime. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Anyone.
In Syria right now, the split still largely remains along political lines, but there's concern that as this increasingly bloody conflict continues, it could turn into a sectarian one as well. Sarah Firth, RT, Damascus, Syria.
Well, still to come on the program, superpower games. Washington and Beijing representatives meet to discuss cooperation while the U.S. moves its forces into China's backyard. And there could be an attack on Iran by this summer. That's the prediction of Russia's general staff as the blame game, between Tehran and Tel Aviv escalates with allegations surrounding 2 bomb attacks on Israeli embassies. Yet another wave of credit rating downgrades has hit the EU, with Moody's, one of the big 3 raters, slashing the scores of Italy, Spain and 4 other nations. This as the bloc labors to erect a debt barrier around Greece amidst hopes that extreme austerity there will halt any possible contagion. As RT's Jacob Greaves reports, it's a plan that already seems to be unraveling.
A system under siege. MPs drowned out the pleas of tens of thousands of demonstrators massed within earshot, passing another round of unpopular cuts.
It looks like more and more people are in Athens and Greece are realizing that bankruptcy default is 1,000 times better than the slow death of the current policies being pushed on Greece from Brussels and from Berlin.
People have been left asking, who can they trust to serve their interests?
The measures are very, very tough for the poor people especially, and this is the reason that we feel betrayal.
I think more measures will have to be taken, and it's not going to work in the end. There will be another bill equally bad, and I don't know, I hope for the best, but I don't see it coming.
Nobody sees it coming. Nobody with any reality sense of reality.
The Greek government has cut more jobs and slashed funding for the nation.
People are smashing buildings, throwing fire bombs, and there's no end in sight. It will increase until they get their thing together and throw the reactionary power mongers serving Berlin and Brussels. Throw them out of the country.
Structure of the society and the infrastructure of the whole country. We know that it is impossible to repay this debt, that we have now signs that it is illegal or odious. We cannot continue like that because the policy that the government is following actually increases the debt instead of finding a solution.
Exactly. This is the way it'll get much worse until the present politicians get their thing together and throw the reactionary banksters out of the country.
Is something sought by an increasing number. Despite the turmoil, the government warns would follow.
What is bad about our political system is that they have tried exactly to intimidate even more the Greek people by this threat of the catastrophes that are going to come. The only way out at this point is the default. Default is going to be very tough for us, but it's going to be a better solution than this slow death.
Absolutely. This guy is so right, so right. Hopefully will the Greek people and the politicians and whoever has any power left in the country gets their thing together and throws the banksters and the Berlin almost warmongers, because it will lead to a civil disobedience and a kind of war even in the EU.
Greaves, RT, Athens.
Now, despite Greece passing its harshest austerity package yet, there's no guarantee it will get more bailout cash. Athens still has conditions to fulfill, including
all of the cash is going back to the banksters. Any money they get, so-called help, will not land in Greece. It will be sent out of the country to the foreign banksters.
make the mistake of lending too much money to countries, and our government's that stupid that they take loans much more than they can pay back? Or I insist, is this part of a model where, like Shylock's pound of flesh, the unpayability of these sovereign debts is later used to control entire countries? And it's so sad to see the same sickening scene time and again. Protesters taking to the streets, they are repressed by the police with tear gas, they throw stones, somebody gets injured, hundreds get injured,
This guy from Buenos Aires, he evidently knows pretty well what's going on, and I hope the Greeks listen to him.
Bankers perched on the 50th floor boardrooms, looking down at these horrific scenes and just laughing at it all.
The troika of Greek lenders are due to meet on Wednesday to give the Athens bailout their preliminary approval. The final say, however, rests with the German parliament, something that's not sitting well with Max Keiser. Coming up next hour, a unique take on Europe's debt.
Max Keiser going right to the truth. Here he comes. He's great. Watch RT.
So we see over and over, there's a Greek deal, there is not a Greek deal, there's a Greek deal, there's not a Greek deal.
On again, off again, there's a deal, no there's not. We're German, we're crazy, we're trying to milk you dry and steal the Elgin marbles, but the UK already stole them.
They really get to this, the essence of what's going on. Watch them on RT.
In the U.S. comes as a testing point in relations between the two economic giants. Due to meet with his American counterpart Joe Biden, the two are expected to work on ties against the backdrop of a U.S. military buildup in the Asia-Pacific. Michael Raska, a defense analyst at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, says the visit is a chance for China to share its worldview.
2012 is also a very important year in Chinese political system. It's a year where you'll see a generational shift in Chinese political system. Xi Jinping basically represents the fifth generations of new Chinese leaders, which will take a helm after this year. He's basically posed to become a general party secretary in October this year and become China's future president. And secondly, he wants to give a sneak preview of he wants to basically show himself, introduce himself to the U.S. Now, there's a very little information.
Embargo on Iran's oil exports, of which China is now the biggest buyer. Meanwhile, Russia's military has made its own assessment of Iran's near future. RT's Peter Oliver explains.
Well, Nikolai Mikhailov, the chief of the general staff of the Russian military, has said that he believes that there could be an attack on Iran by the West by the summer of this year. Now, he's basing that claim on intelligence since the start of the Arab Spring last year. Now, he doesn't name one particular nation, only saying that it could be from Western powers. Now, this comes just after two Israeli diplomats' cars were targeted on Monday in both the Indian and Georgian capitals. Now, Tel Aviv.
Most probably we've got Israelis, Mossad, doing this work, even killing Jews, because they have a higher goal, higher object of pursuing. So kill your own people for reasons that are superior to being a human being with mutual respect. Anything to demonize Iran, even killing your own people.
They're not carrying out regime change, but in fact, everyone who's watching knows that indeed is the U.S. policy to create pressure on Iran, carry out covert operations, economic sanctions, and now these new sanctions are not really even like the old sanctions. They are saying to the rest of the world, if you dare do business with Iran's central bank, if you buy Iranian oil, which constitutes half of Iran's GNP, if you have any business with Iran whatsoever, you will not have access to American banks, to American corporations, to the American market. This is, in fact, a blockade.
And a blockade like this is against international law. It is a declaration of war by the United States first and foremost.
Live from Moscow, our top stories put to the test. As the UN General Assembly scrutinizes the Syrian crisis, the move is seen by some as an attempt to tighten the screws on Russia and China and push through a new resolution two nations consider one-sided. Europe gets hit with yet another wave of downgrades as confidence collapses over the bloc's future. This as the EU presses ahead with its austerity crusade against a reluctant Greece. And China's vice president arrives in the U.S. as the two giants struggle to find common ground.
Okay, I guess this is what we've been looking for.
The Asia Pacific. Well, a circle of tension is contracting, around Iran as Tel Aviv accuses it of orchestrating attacks on Israeli diplomats. It comes amid strained relations in the region, with the West deeply concerned over Tehran's controversial nuclear program. For more on that, RT talked to Brian Becker, a member of the Answer anti-war coalition.
The United States declares war on Iran.
Thank you for joining us on RT.
Thank you.
What does the United States want from tightening the sanctions? I mean, it's even beyond tightening the sanctions now.
Indeed it is. The United States government has created an artificial crisis. That's first and foremost. It's a manufactured crisis. Iran is complying with the IAEA. Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. Iran is not threatening its neighbors. Iran has not started a war with any of its neighbors. Israel, on the other hand, has hundreds of nuclear weapons, and unlike Iran, refuses to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, does not allow IAEA inspectors into its country. So there's not really a nuclear menace or a nuclear danger from Iran. So what is the cause? What's the cause of the crisis, of the artificial crisis? The real goal is the United States government has embarked on a course of extreme economic aggression against Iran with the hope that by creating economic suffering, economic isolation, economic misery, that part of the population will rise up or become disenfranchised with the government so that the U.S. can do, as it has in history, carry out regime change.
They denied that. The U.S. denied that it's trying to carry out a regime change in Iran.
Right. I mean, we have to take that with a very, very big grain of salt, because we know that since 1979, the United States refuses to have relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Why? Is it because Iran is a dictatorship? Well, it's actually a democratic government. It has democratic features far beyond some of America's foremost allies in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, for instance. Since 1979, Iran became an independent government. Before that, between 1953 and 1979, when the Shah was there, the Shah acted basically as a proxy or a puppet or a client of the American power. And so the U.S. says they're not carrying out regime change, but in fact, everyone who's watching knows that indeed is the U.S. policy, to create pressure on Iran, carry out covert operations, economic sanctions, and now these new sanctions are not really even like the old sanctions. They are saying to the rest of the world, if you dare do business with Iran's central bank, if you buy Iranian oil, which constitutes half of Iran's GNP, if you have any business with Iran whatsoever, you will not have access to American banks, to American corporations, to the American market. This is in fact a blockade, something like an economic blockade of Iran, and by international law, an economic blockade is an act of war. And so we should understand it just like that.
So what do you think Iran's response is going to be?
Well, Iran so far has been very prudent, even though they said that they would consider closing the Strait of Hormuz.
For more, go to Russia Today. Watch Russia Today every day and stay updated as to what's going on.
Media. In fact, Iran has not done anything to give the U.S. a pretext, an excuse, a provocation, so to speak, that would allow the United States or Israel to trigger a set of military actions. Iran, I think, is also telling its people that we are not panicked. We, the Iranian government, are not panicked, that they're trying to show that they have a serenity and a calmness and a confidence, and that they will weather the storm. But in fact, economic sanctions are taking a bite on the Iranian economy right now.
So let's stop these sanctions, get our own governments around the world to break the American blockade, fight for peace by doing that.
A plan B should Israel attack.
I think the Israelis try to pretend that Iran constitutes an existential threat to Israel. I don't think that that, in fact, is the case, even though Iran's military has the capability to.
The real threat is Israel and the United States. They are the warmongers, not Iran.
The Israeli government has a pattern and a practice of invasion and bombing of its neighbors in the Middle East.
Right. Everybody, we should know this. Why can't we see it? Why can't everyone see this?
Permitted by international law and subject to IAEA inspections. In other words,
get the IAEA and let them inspect Israel. The first priority, inspect Israel's atomic weapons.
Strikes against the Iranian government. The Americans don't want that right now. Even though they're happy to have Iran in a state of tension, they don't really want Israel to become the main protagonist with the Iranian government by carrying out an unprovoked military strike. I mean, I'm talking about the main sectors in the American establishment, because that would then present the crisis, a death struggle between the Islamic Republic of Iran on one side and the Israeli Zionist regime on the other. And in that case, Iran will be able to mobilize mass support throughout the Middle East for it. The United States has a different tack. They want to keep Israel sort of in the background, looming, endangering, threatening Iran in one way, keeping Iran in a state of tension, perhaps militarily, but have the economic sanctions do the bulk of the work by carrying out economic and financial isolation against the Iranian government. They think in the long term that's the easier way, the better way, the more effective way to carry out regime change.
The cynics in the Pentagon.
Over Israel's intentions. So what if Israel does decide to strike Iran? And this is, a U.S. official says it's hard to know what's a bluster and what's not with the Israelis.
Well, I think a lot of that is baloney and nonsense. The Israelis are the recipient, the benefactor of $3 billion a year in U.S. military aid. If they do something that's completely contrary to what Washington wants, they will be on the very short end of the stick. The Israelis are not dominating and dictating U.S. policy in this geostrategically important. They are not. They have a big influence in Washington. They have a strong lobby. But when it comes to Iran, or when it comes to Iraq, the Israelis do not tell the United States what to do. It's vice versa. If Israel strikes now, if the conflict is presented that way between the Islamic Republic and Israel, the people of the Middle East will rally to the side of Iran.
The assassination of the Iranian scientist, which Rick Santorum called half a measure, or John Bolton of the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, the sanctions, the tightening of the sanctions, the coalition that the U.S. is trying to build against Iran. What is Iran going to do to face all of this pressure?
Well, Iran has certain allies too. Iran has Russia, and it has China. Increasingly, it has Venezuela and Cuba. In other words, those governments in the world, in addition, of course, to Syria, which has its own problems right now, but the countries in the world that don't want the entire world to be dominated by one power, the United States of America, they recognize that the existence of Iran as an independent government is something that is positive, meaning that if the United States were to be successful in carrying out regime change in Iran, they would be emboldened to carry out further destabilizing efforts against other powers, including Russia and China, by the way, even though they're great powers. So I think that Iran has allies, and I think Iran is trying to show that they can weather the storm, and also that they can rally their population. In spite of the fact that divisions that were revealed in 2009 after the elections, the presidential elections, the Iranian people as a whole don't believe they should be sanctioned. The Iranian people believe that they have, as they do, the right to develop nuclear power for peaceful civilian purposes. And I think right now the Iranian government is trying to weather the storm. They're also making it clear that they do.
What options do they have?
They have limited options. They have limited options, and that's the big issue here, I think, is that in America right now, in the United States, nobody feels this issue. They don't feel there's a war looming. They don't feel the problem of economic sanctions. It's the Iranians who are feeling it. It's the tension, the pressure, the economic problems are all one-sided. This is like a great power, the 700-pound gorilla who decides to sit wherever it wants to sit. And it can create immense tension and pressure and economic suffering somewhere else without having to endure any political price. So that's the big problem. And as a peace activist and as someone who believes in human rights, and I think we'll see this more and more in the United States, we are starting to concentrate our efforts to expose the fact that the United States government is carrying out through a different set of tactics the same thing that they did in Iraq. They carried out regime change in Iraq. Not to make Iraq more democratic, more human rights oriented, but to dominate Iraq. And I think they want to do that in Iran, and we need to have people outside of Iran stand up and say Iran should not be alone on this.
Right, don't let them be alone. We must support Iran's struggle for the right to survive as an independent nation.
The United States definitely play a role in U.S. policy towards Iran. That, by the way, has been the case ever since the Iranian Revolution. Iran has factored into American politics. In this case, the Republican candidates are sort of baiting Obama and suggesting that if Obama is reelected, we will have a nuclear-armed Iran someday soon.
Will Obama do something just to counter their statements because it's an election year?
I don't think so. I think that it's not out of the question that Obama could opportunistically up the ante or even escalate tensions or even allow some sort of limited military attack against Iran in order to show how tough he is and why he's not a liberal or something like that. But I don't think so. This is a very big project for the Pentagon, for the CIA, for the U.S. establishment. I think it goes beyond electoral politics. And I think the Obama administration and the Pentagon are having a carefully calibrated approach that won't, again, with regime change, the Republicans and Democrats share the same objective.
Obama is the Pentagon's man.
They both share the same objective, which is to bring Iran back into an American sphere of influence. And I think the Republicans can't move Obama that much because Obama actually has the backing of the Pentagon in terms of this particular approach. The Pentagon is bogged down in Afghanistan. They really were pushed out of Iraq. They have a lot of military problems. A major full-scale war right now, which could happen even if they don't intend it, by people climb the escalation ladder.
Wow. Obama is the Pentagon's man. We've got to stop this war against Iran. Join the grassroots progressive peoples of the world.
Scion, Zach Troels, investment activist.
One of the world's best, most well-informed, best reporting television stations you can find, and it's all free of charge, non-commercial. Go to Russia Today on the internet. Russia Today. They have a hell of a lot of programs, a lot of great stuff, 24 hours a day. All kinds of documentaries, debates, reports, news analysis. I don't think you have any television station in the world that can compete with the quality and the quantity of this television station. A lot of the criticism against Russia today from the West is that Putin is a dictator and he is his own boss against the people. But actually, Putin is a bulwark against corporate fascism in the world.
Scrutinizes the Syrian crisis. The move is seen by some as an attempt to tighten the screws on Russia and China and push through a new resolution the two nations consider one-sided. Europe gets hit with yet another wave of downgrades as confidence collapses over the bloc.
We got to help the people in Greece fighting the banksters, the gangsters in Berlin and Brussels.
And China's vice president arrives in the U.S. as the two giants struggle to find...
China and Russia, the two major, most important countries in the world, to help Iran in its rightful demand for sovereignty.